Well, friends, I'm happy again to have Dr. Maurice Robinson, who has been generous with his time for us today. And I have some Q&A, some questions that you have asked and you've asked me and would like to hear answers from Dr. Robinson. So I'm just going to kick off, and I've already made some introductions to Dr. Robinson, so I hope you know who he is. And if you don't yet, please go and check out some of my earlier videos with him. But I'm going to kick off asking Dr. Robinson. One person wanted to know the current status of your various projects that you've got going. I understand there's one with the PA, maybe a textual commentary. What projects are you working on right now, Dr. Robinson?
Well, the primary project that I am working on has been this has been going on for 25 years basically, has been the full collation of all manuscripts that contain the Pericope Adulterae, the story of the woman in adultery, collated down to even spelling differences. And I've looked at probably close to 2,500 manuscripts, and I've collated all of those that have it. I've collated all of the lectionaries that have the passage, and I've even collated the manuscripts that omit the passage by taking note of their bordering regions, which would be John 7:51 and 52, and John 8:12 and 13. And in addition to that collation project, which is still ongoing, if more manuscripts are discovered, I just add them to my electronic database. But I'm also compiling very extensive bibliography that encompasses just about any source that has been published or even on the internet in many cases that has dealt with the readings in the woman in adultery passage. And it doesn't matter whether they are coming from the far extreme right wing or the far extreme left wing or right in the center. I'm just covering all of these, and I've got right now somewhere close to 860 pages of bibliography. And that's actually more pages than I have in my full collation of the circa 2,500 manuscripts for the Pericope Adulterae itself. So that's the most pressing project right now because I would like to get it published, and that's what Joey McCollum is going to be working on when he ever finishes his PhD, and he's going to set it up in a format that is going to be similar to that of the Editio Critica Maior, the ECM, and from there we'll see about getting it published. The textual commentary is a separate project. I am writing a textual commentary piece by piece on variant readings where the clear Byzantine majority, it differs from the Nestle-Aland 27 apparatus. I use Nestle-Aland 27 rather than their 28th edition because they have more data in the apparatus. And I look at the readings in Nestle-Aland 27 first that were supported by just one manuscript, as opposed to the Gothic M, which is the Mehrheitstext, the majority text, and I give a commentary on why the Byzantine reading should be considered original. Then I moved on to the readings in Nestle 27 that were supported by two and only two named manuscripts. And I do the same thing with the commentary. Then I moved on to the ones supported by three named manuscripts in NA 27, and I wrote the commentary there. And then I'm still stuck in the middle of writing the ones that have four and only four named manuscripts. I've got a long way to go. I probably have written commentary on them somewhere around 400 variant units. My tabulations show going up to the maximum number of witnesses supporting an NA reading against a Gothic M, there's somewhere around 3,000 variants. That leaves me probably working till I'll be 95 years old. So somehow I'm not sure I'm going to finish it, but I'll keep plugging away. In fact, I've just worked on three items for the commentary that happened to be brought up by some discussions that were on the internet, and I just did those this week. So there's more to come, but it's coming very piecemeal as compared to what is going on in the woman in adultery passage.
Will your textual commentary be something analogous to the famous Metzger textual commentary, except from a Byzantine perspective?
It'll be similar to it in the sense that I'm going to talk about individual variant units, but where Metzger quite often only gives 2 sentences or maybe a very short paragraph, in many cases, I'm writing 3 or 4 pages of commentary to defend the Byzantine reading, as opposed to the very brief format that Metzger uses, or even that Roger Omenson uses in his textual commentary that is designed for English translators or foreign language translators based on Metzger.
Well, I'm going to put a plug in here, an unasked for plug on this. I think some of your former PhD students need to pitch in and help so on this project, because it sounds like a great project that would be a very nice thing to be able to have in our hands. So
Jonathan Borland actually is working on some items that I am not yet addressing, so he's got some textual commentary in the works as well. So put it all together, we might combine to produce a more solid enterprise on this.
that'd be great. That'd be great. Well, as much as I'd like to pursue asking you more questions about your projects, I want to get to a few other questions that viewers have asked. And one of the ones that keeps coming up is, do you have a recommendation for a translation? Is there a translation that you would recommend for people to use?
Well, my first recommendation would be, why not learn Koine Greek and read the New Testament in the original? On the other hand, there are people out there that have mental blocks against learning Greek or other languages. They need English translations. This is, in fact, what the King James translators said in their preface. There needs to be English translations. Right now, we probably have too many English translations. And the worst part is we're appealing these translations to every single possible group there can be out there. And much of it is just a marketing ploy. And I don't think we need that. We need good, solid English translations. I realize there's going to be the various dynamic equivalence ones, there's going to be the formal equivalence, there's even going to be the paraphrases that are out there. I have no great love for paraphrases. I have a little more love for the dynamic equivalence translations, but I have the most love for the formal equivalence translations, as long as they don't get to the point that they read too woodenly. As long as they read smoothly, I have no problem with a formal equivalence. So out of the formal equivalence group, in the published translations, I favor, and what I use for teaching, preaching, and Bible studies, New King James. I do that because it's in modern English. It does follow the tendency of the Old King James, but it also has footnotes in it that will tell you not only where the Nestle United Bible Society's text differs from the TR base text that the New King James is translated from, but it also has M text notes where the M means majority, and those M notes will show where key Byzantine readings actually occur that differ from the TR underlying the New King James. The problem with those M notes is they could have had 3 times the number of M notes in the New King James, and they really should, and I would say this as an appeal to Thomas Nelson Company, they really should consider adding more of the M notes to make the New King James more useful. Even if it's based on the TR, let people know how the actual majority text or Byzantine text reads. But that's the one that I use primarily. Now, Secondarily, I have no problem using formal equivalence translations like, for example, the New American Standard or the English Standard Version. Those are fine, except, as you know, they're based on the critical text. So if I'm going to use those translations, I'm going to adjust them at whatever points there's a key variant where the majority Byzantine text happens to differ from the critical text that they are based on. So with my editing, I can use those, but that's a lot of work. I even suggested to the publishers of these that why not bring out an edition that is based on the Byzantine text and keep basically 98.5% of your text exactly as it is and just add in the other readings. And the reaction I got from the publishers was basically don't mess with our cash cow. I did get a reception from one person when I brought up the issue. I don't want to name which one it was or what translation because it might get somebody in trouble. But when I proposed a majority text version of that translation, the fellow actually laughed at me.
Wow.
So that sort of gives you an idea. There needs to be a good published in print English translation of the Byzantine text. Now, when we get off of the published versions and go to the ones that are available on the internet, then we're talking about actual Byzantine translations. And of course, Mr. Boyd's translation is very good. He's had the experience as an SIL translator, and I could easily recommend that one. It's good, it's formal equivalence. I have no problem with it. There might be some little places where it could be improved, but I admit I haven't read through the entire Boyd translation yet. But that's a good one. Second to that, you can look at the one that Paul Esposito did called the English Majority Text Version. That one reads well too, although I think there may be a few more places where it could stand some improvement. And a third one out there would be Michael Paul Johnson's Web Bible. That one also is good, and all of these are based on the Byzantine text. My problem that other people would have, and I have as well, is each of these are still one-man translations. And that's opening the door for problems or dangers, depending where the problems might exist. What needs to be done, and I still recommend it, is the formation of a formal committee that could start with one or all of those and go over them in detail and then make decisions if there are problems to try to smooth out the difficulties and produce a much better committee-based Byzantine translation that then could be published, and I would hope by a major publisher.
Right.
But trying to get a committee together for that is somewhat difficult because first you've got to get those who would be willing to be committed to a Byzantine translation. I was asked to be a consultant, not a translator, since I've never worked as a translator on any translation, but I was asked to be a consultant on one translation that I assume is still in progress. It hasn't yet been published. Again, not naming the translation. And I was going to be a consultant on it because it was going to be based on the Byzantine text. But then the financial backers of that translation, after it started getting underway, decided they were going to have it based only on the critical text and not the Byzantine. So I said, adios. And I stopped working as a consultant on that one. And this is the problem. It is difficult to find people that really want to see a Byzantine text translation in published, and I'm talking about good hard copy printed form. I think the best chance going at this level is probably Mr. Boyd's translation, because there are some people looking at it and considering publishing it.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and
I would like to see a committee review of it just to try to smooth out any problems that might exist.
yeah, I've had a chance to look at that as well. I have a copy of it,
Mm.
a hard copy of it, and yes, I think it's a good translation from what I've seen. And the nice thing about it is he has a lot of text critical notes, at least showing where the
Right.
variants are. And so
And I
that's
think they
very
are
nice.
helpful.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I'll ask you one more question in this segment, Dr. Robinson. A viewer asked me to see if you had any opinions. He knows it's not your
I've got
sp
plenty of them.
well, my opinions are the only thing I'm truly expert on. But he wanted to know your view on Old Testament textual criticism, and if you'd want to give us some thoughts about the trajectory of Old Testament textual criticism, anything really you'd want to say on that subject.
I know a lot about Old Testament textual criticism, although I generally do not practice such. My area, as you well know, is New Testament textual criticism. But I obviously have read the sources, and some of their principles are good, some of them I would question. And for example, you have Emmanuel Tove's book on Old Testament textual criticism, which has gone through how many editions now? Three or four. And every time he starts changing some of the things he's using as his principles. But what is going on? There are other sources, by the way, that also deal with Old Testament textual criticism. But the primary text for the Old Testament, unlike the New Testament, is that you've got a very solid text that has undergone very few changes, and that is the Masoretic text. And the Hebrew Masoretes have reproduced that text with great care and in detail, and they reproduced it even in places where some of its readings didn't make sense to them. They preserved the problematic reading and sometimes put it another reading in the margin. This is called the Kethiv and Kare readings, written and to be read. And they did a fantastic job of trying to preserve this with a lot of rules for the scribes who were copying the manuscripts, and we won't go into all of that, but they kept it in pretty tight bounds. What is going on with most Old Testament textual critics is they have a inclination to add to or change the Masoretic text in places that really don't necessarily need changing by bringing in readings from, first of all, the Septuagint, sometimes from the Samaritan Pentateuch, sometimes from the Old Testament Syriac Peshitta, sometimes from the Latin Vulgate, and sometimes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which apparently reflects another textual transmission, a different Vorlage. And there are questions that I would have about this. I recognize that sometimes the Dead Sea Scrolls readings that differ from the Masoretic text may even agree with the Septuagint, showing that this type of text was circulating. But on the other hand, I would not say that if you have a group that was more of a very strict cult that broke away from the mainstream Jerusalem temple scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees group, that you should necessarily, for any reason, consider their texts to be superior than the ones that were being preserved in Jerusalem and that area. So I do have a question about suddenly thinking, well, since we have such old Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, that we should use them to correct the Masoretic text, when the Masoretic text, even though our current manuscripts of it are very late, we know that they were still strictly preserved from way, way back, because all one has to do is look at the Dead Sea Scrolls Isaiah scroll compared with the Masoretic text, and they are almost, but not totally, identical. So we know the Masoretes did do a good job of preserving the text. But that's my view on the Old Testament. But I've not been asked to do any text critical work on the Old Testament. I just know what is going on, and I still think we should stay primarily with the Masoretic text. And by the way, it's not my opinion. This is what I learned from my two Hebrew teachers in seminary.
That's good. That's good. So to oversimplify, at the risk of oversimplifying, as a layperson who's not a textual critic, it makes sense to me that I would go to the Greeks for the Greek, and I would go to the Hebrews for the Hebrew. Egypt wasn't primarily a Greek-speaking area when in the first century and the third century, whatever, when these manuscripts were being produced, I think it's just safer to go to the people to whom the oracles were committed and go to them and find my text. But that's probably an oversimplification, but it's a pretty easy rule of thumb for a guy like me.
Well, I see the Egyptian Greek texts, the ones we know from the papyri, for example, and even what you have going up to Aleph and B for the first 4 centuries, they are going to reflect, as far as I would see, the local text of Egypt. And it probably does differ from, say, what would be the local text in, say, Caesarea, Palestine area, or in the primary Greek speaking areas, which would be Turkey, Greece, and that southern Italy, that area. And necessarily there would be some differences with the different versions in other languages, which would include, of course, Latin over in the West, and also you've got Syriac, and then elsewhere Armenian and Georgian and that. But in Egypt, it is very interesting that the native language there at that time would have been Coptic, which is a descendant of the old hieroglyphic language. And it is probably very important to note that the Coptic text, whether you're dealing with the Sahidic or the Bohairic or the Fayumic or that, is almost totally aligned with the Alexandrian Greek text in Egypt. I have a theory, can't prove it, but I do have a theory that the Coptic text, as a translation from the Greek, was being made from Alexandrian type manuscripts that were probably prepared, maybe in Alexandria or environs, with the skillful philological know-how that the people in Alexandria would apply to classical literature. And I think that the Alexandrian text may have resulted from this, and then that was used as the base for translation into the Coptic at a very early stage, which then explains the extremely close relation between the Coptic and the Alexandrian Greek text. Now, of course, I can't prove it, but that's just my hypothesis on this.
Is it relatively uncontroversial? I know there's some discussion about different text types, but is it relatively uncontroversial about, our two exemplars, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, these two manuscripts in some way being related to Egypt somehow? In other words, I've read different things about where they could have been, produced at. My understanding is some people say, as far away as Caesarea or things like that. But is it generally agreed upon among textual critics that these texts have been somehow influenced by Egyptian manuscripts?
They well could be a result of whatever had been done editorially, say in Alexandria, as the basis for the Coptic version, and whether they were themselves, Aleph and B, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, produced in Egypt themselves, that is probably debatable and questionable, and they well may have been produced in Caesarea. Again, I don't know. It all depends. Origen brought some manuscripts with him from Egypt to Caesarea. Well, were they the ones? I don't know. Constantine ordered 50 manuscripts to be prepared that were in threes and fours. What does that mean? columns of 3 and columns of 4, perhaps. If that were the case, then the only manuscripts we've got in 3 columns are Vaticanus. The only ones in 4 columns, Sinicus. Could be. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And without further information, neither does anybody else. All they can do is speculate as to the origin. But I still think that Caesarea might be where Sinicus and Vaticanus were produced, although they were being produced from some archetypal manuscript or manuscripts that may have been prepared in Alexandria that had then also been used as a basis for the Coptic version. But again, I can't prove anything, so all you're hearing at this point is my reasoned speculation.
But I mean, it's very common. I mean, everybody kind of refers to these, or at least before CBGM, it was everybody sort of referred to, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus as Alexandrian manuscripts. So I guess what I was asking is it that's pretty well uncontroversial that they had some sort of Egyptian influence, or is that controversial?
Probably it is. You've got people out there like JF who's changed his mind from what he had been writing 50 years ago, and he's thinking that the Alexandrian type of text is probably something that could have been found anywhere in the entire Roman Empire. So again, we know there's later Alexandrian manuscripts such as Codex Regius, which is L, and L was definitely not copied in Egypt, but it found its way somewhere else into the Roman Empire. So there are some like that. 33 is another one, the minuscule 33. We know that there was some of this. Now, one of the things that has been changing in current text critical praxis is they don't want to call these text types. And I think there's a good reason for this because originally a text type, and this goes back to Westcott and Hort's categorization, a text type would have been considered a recensional product. So for Westcott and Hort, they had an Alexandrian text that they didn't favor, which they considered to be recensional from what they called the neutral text. The neutral text for them was the non-recensional text, and then the Alexandrian was slightly revised but recensional. The Byzantine for them was created by a formal revision in AD 350 or thereabouts, and the Western text was just basically the popular uncontrolled text that was dominant in the 2nd century. And I think what the moving away today is, we know that these texts, there's no clear evidence that they are recensional in the sense of a formal revision, but they do cluster together, and this is the term now being used. We have textual clusters. Now, you could call them the alpha, beta, gamma, delta clusters if you want, and that's what Streeter called them. But if you took them in terms, the alpha cluster relates to Codex Alexandrinus, which is Byzantine. So the alpha cluster is the Byzantine. The beta cluster relates to Codex B, Vaticanus. So the beta cluster is the Alexandrian. The gamma cluster, that's Caesarean because you don't spell Caesarea with a G. And then the delta cluster relates to Codex D, Bezae. And so even though he put these neutral labels on it, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, he's still talking about the same thing as long as you don't call them revision text types created by a formal recension. As long as they exist as clusters, yes, there are clusters, but they're not recensional text types. So I just want to clarify that for those that have been hearing all these terms that nobody believes in text types anymore. But they do believe in textual clusters because they do exist and can statistically be shown to exist. But it's like a series of Venn diagrams. One cluster bleeds into another that bleeds into another. And that's where current thinking on the text types or textual clusters happens to be going at the moment.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this segment, and I threw some random questions at you there at the end that I've been curious about that sort of came up while we were talking about Egypt. But I think this has been a profitable session, and I hope those who have been watching have gleaned some new information. And Dr. Robinson, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and learn from you.
Glad to be here and glad to talk.
All right.